Okay, so let me start today with a sequence of events, just the facts, in the exact order they happened. 5 minutes before Trump publicly announced a halt to operations against Iran, something happened in financial markets. Someone placed a position of $1.5 billion betting that stocks would go up. At the exact same moment, $192 million in oil futures was sold, a bet that oil prices would fall. The trades were 4 to 6 times larger than anything else happening in the entire market at that moment. 5 minutes later, Trump made his announcement. Stocks went up, oil went down, exactly as those positions had predicted. Now here's what I want to be absolutely clear about before we go any further. I am not here today to accuse any specific person of anything. I am not going to tell you who placed those trades. I am not going to tell you it was definitely illegal. And I am not going to build a theory around individuals making choices in dark rooms. What I am going to do is something considerably more useful. I am going to explain the system that makes moments like this not just possible, but almost inevitable. The structural logic that consistently distributes information, and therefore financial advantage, to people close to power before it reaches everyone else. And I am going to show you why understanding that logic tells you more about how the world actually works than any individual story of corruption ever could. Because here's the thing, you do not need a conspiracy to explain what happened. You just need to understand how systems work. And once you understand that, you cannot unsee it. Most people imagine that major decisions, especially decisions about active conflicts, are made in rooms with tight security. The information stays contained, the announcement is made, everyone finds out at the same moment, the playing field is level. That is the official model. And in its broad outlines, it is not entirely wrong. Security protocols exist. Classification systems exist. Rules about who knows what and when exist. But here is what those models miss. They describe how information is supposed to flow officially. They do not describe how it actually flows informally. And the gap between those two things is one of the most important and least discussed features of how power actually operates in the real world. Think about what it actually takes to turn a major presidential decision into a public announcement. It does not happen in one room with one person pressing a button. A decision of that scale involves dozens of conversations before it becomes official. Legal teams need to understand the implications. Communications departments need to prepare the messaging. Allied governments need to be notified before their populations hear it on the news. Financial regulators need to be aware of potential market movements. Government departments that will be affected need time to prepare their responses. Every single one of those conversations is a moment where information travels outward from the center of the decision into a wider network. Not because anyone is necessarily doing something wrong, but because turning a decision into a functioning reality requires involving many people across many institutions. And each of those people exists inside their own networks, their own professional relationships, their own trusted contacts, their own circles of people they speak to regularly about things that matter. The information does not stay still, it moves. And the question that the 5-minute trade forces us to ask is, who does it move to first? And are those people positioned to act on it before the rest of the world finds out? Now here's the part I want to spend the most time on, because this is where most coverage of stories like this goes wrong, and where I think the professor's framework offers something genuinely more useful than the alternatives. The easy story about the trade is, someone corrupt in the room made a call and tipped off a connected person who placed the trade. Maybe that is exactly what happened. Maybe it is not. We do not know. But the more important story, the one that operates whether or not any individual acted corruptly, is about structure, about how systems naturally distribute information along the lines of power and proximity. And understanding that story is far more useful because it explains not just this specific trade, but the pattern that produces moments like this over and over again. Let me give you a way of picturing this. Imagine concentric circles. At the very center is the decision itself. The president, the small group directly involved in making the call. Moving outward from that center, the next circle is the immediate institutional environment. The advisors, the departments, the agencies that need to know in order to implement the decision. Moving outward again, the next circle is the broader ecosystem of institutions connected to those departments. The financial firms, the legal networks, the advisory relationships that the people in the inner circles maintain as a normal part of their professional lives. Information does not travel randomly across those circles. It travels along relationships, along trust networks built over years of shared professional experience and mutual dependence. dependence. It travels fastest and most completely to people who are already positioned at the intersection of political and financial power, because those are the people whose cooperation is needed, whose relationships are relied upon, whose institutional positions make them part of the functional machinery through which decisions become reality. Think of it like a doctor who gets paid based on how sick their patients are. Most doctors are ethical. Most would genuinely try to heal, but the underlying structure creates dynamics that are very hard to ignore. In the same way, most people in positions of institutional proximity to major decisions are ethical. Most would not make a direct call to tip off a traitor, but the structure creates conditions where information naturally flows toward people with resources and relationships, and those people are naturally positioned to act on it. Nobody needs to be corrupt for this to happen. The system produces it. Here's what I want to ask you before we continue. Before watching this video, did you imagine that information about major decisions reaches everyone at the same moment, or did you already sense that some people consistently know first? Tell me in the comments, because how you answer that question tells you a great deal about how honestly you see the system you are living inside. Now let me connect this to everything we have been building on this channel across the past several weeks. Because the trade is not an isolated event. It is one piece of a much larger picture that has been coming into focus video by video. We started with the nuclear fear narrative, how official justifications do political work that serves interests beyond the stated goal, how the threat gets amplified to create permission for action that has different drivers underneath. We covered the Geneva offer, how Iran put a free solution on the table before any of this started, and how the situation began anyway hours later. The free option was available and not taken. We covered the price list, Trump reportedly sending Arab states a specific financial demand. $5 trillion to continue, $2.5 trillion to stop. The financial architecture underneath the conflict made explicitly visible. We covered the secret deal, Trump quietly allowing Iranian oil to flow to protect American energy prices, while Israel took unilateral action that collapsed that arrangement and sent prices toward $126 a barrel. We covered the price tag, the Treasury Secretary publicly telling ordinary Americans they would face 50 days of higher prices in exchange for 50 years of no Iranian nuclear capability, the cost explicitly assigned to ordinary people. Each of those videos was showing you a different face of the same underlying reality. That major conflicts, like most major decisions in the global system, produce costs and benefits that do not distribute themselves equally. They distribute themselves along the lines of proximity to power. The people closest to the decisions, the people whose networks extend deepest into the institutions making those decisions, capture the financial upside. The people furthest from the decisions absorb the costs. The trade is the most visible and most undeniable expression of that pattern. $1.5 billion, 5 minutes, before an announcement that moved markets in exactly the direction those positions had predicted. That is not coincidence. It is the system operating according to its own internal logic. The same logic that produced every other piece of this picture we have been building together. Now let me bring this to the level that matters most for the people watching this video. Because this is not just a story about one trade or one conflict, it is a story about a structural feature of how the modern global system operates. And understanding that feature changes how you evaluate every major official statement you will ever hear. Every major decision creates winners and losers. That is unavoidable. Decisions have consequences, and consequences distribute themselves unequally. The question is not whether there are winners and losers. The question is whether the process that produces them is visible and subject to the same rules for everyone, or whether it operates through informal networks that are invisible to most people and that consistently deliver advantage to those with proximity to power. The trade tells you something specific about that question. When a position of $1.5 billion gets placed 5 minutes before a major announcement, it means that somewhere in the network connecting the decision room to the broader financial system, information was available to someone before it was available to everyone, and that someone had the resources, the relationships, and the positioning to act on it. Now contrast that with the ordinary person. The family paying $4 gas because the conflict has disrupted global energy supply. The pension fund that moved in the wrong direction when the announcement came. The small investor who made a decision based on publicly available information without access to anything that traveled through informal networks. These people are not losing because they made bad decisions. They are losing because the information available to them was different from the information available to others. And that difference is structural. It is a feature of how the system distributes access to knowledge. Iran's parliament speaker made a statement today worth thinking about carefully. He said the announcement of peace talks had been used to create movements in financial markets. Whether or not that specific accusation is accurate, the observation it reflects is important. In a world where major political announcements move markets by enormous amounts in seconds, the relationship between political decisions and financial outcomes is one of the most powerful and least visible forms of advantage that exists. And the people who understand that relationship most deeply and who are positioned to act on it most quickly are not the people watching the news. Here's what I want to know from you. When you see a trade like this, $1.5 billion, 5 minutes, perfectly timed, what does your instinct tell you? Is this the system working as designed or working as it actually works in practice? The distinction matters more than most people realize. Tell me in the comments. So here is what the trade actually reveals. It reveals that information about major decisions does not travel equally to everyone at the same moment. It travels through networks, along relationships, to people positioned at the intersection of political and financial power. And it travels fast enough that those people can act on it before the announcement reaches the rest of the world. It reveals that the costs and benefits of major conflicts, like everything else in the political and economic system, do not distribute themselves randomly. They distribute themselves along the lines of who is closest to the decisions being made. The people furthest from those decisions absorb the costs. The people closest capture the upside. And it reveals something that every video on this channel has been building toward. The official narrative about why conflicts happen, what they are for, and who benefits from them is almost always different from the actual distribution of costs and benefits that the conflict produces in practice. Not because of any single act of corruption, not because of any individual making a bad choice, but because the system has a logic of its own. It distributes information and advantage along the lines of power. And it does so whether anyone consciously chooses that outcome or not. Nobody sits in a room and says out loud that ordinary people should absorb the costs while the people closest to power capture the benefits. But the system produces that outcome anyway, because systems respond to their incentives, whether anyone consciously chooses that or not. The trade was 5 minutes, $1.5 billion. In the middle of a conflict that has cost ordinary people elevated energy prices, economic disruption, and consequences reaching every corner of the global economy, you do not need a conspiracy to explain that. You just need to understand how systems work. Last question. Knowing what you know now about how information travels through powerful networks, about the gap between the official narrative and the actual distribution of costs and benefits, does it change how you will listen to the next major official announcement about the next major conflict? Tell me in the comments. Because I think the honest answer is that once you see this pattern clearly, you cannot unsee it.